Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Navigating Workplace Conflicts. My name is Nicole Mormilo, ILR class of 2012, and I'm the president of the ILR Alumni Association, also known as the ILRAA. Today's session is part of the ILRAA's Career Transition Initiative. This initiative aims to support alumni who are re-entering the workforce, navigating a layoff, or pivoting in their career, and has hosted a series of lunch and learn webinars since February on various subjects like job search with recruiting firms, using social media to find jobs and network, and understanding severance and employment agreements. We also offered complimentary headshots across 6 different cities. We recently partnered with Cornell Alumni Career Programs, which provides career-focused resources, learning opportunities, events, a monthly newsletter, the CU eLinks networking platform, and much more to all of our alumni. They're here to meet you where you are on your career journey, and we're excited to build our partnership to continue bringing you valuable career-related content. I welcome you to introduce yourself in the chat, as you've all been doing, to use the reaction buttons at the bottom of your screen to interact, and I encourage you to ask questions through the Q&A feature. I'll do my best to address alumni questions that were submitted with the registration, posing them to the panelists during the session. Please note that this session is being recorded and will be shared via email with attendance after the session. Finally, note that Cornell staff is online to assist with any tech needs that may come up during the session. I'm thrilled to introduce our panelists today, and then they will take things over. First, we have Sally Klingel, who is the Executive Director of the Martin and Lori Scheinman Institute on Conflict Resolution, the latest part of her wide-reaching 35-plus-year career at Cornell School of Industrial and Labor Relations. She brings her breadth of experience to the role, which includes overseeing key operational aspects of the Institute. Our second panelist is Liz Davis-Frost, and she is a mediator, coach, and question asker. With backgrounds in conflict studies, public administration, and communication, Liz's approach to her work is inherently interdisciplinary and innovative. Currently, this takes shape in her position as Mediation and Training Extension Associate at the Scheinman Institute. Her primary responsibilities are co-teaching the campus mediation practicum courses and developing conflict coaching for constituencies across campus. I'm so thrilled to have these panelists with us today, and I will pass the baton over them to get us started.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Nicole and Alana, for inviting us to be part of this series. I think it's a fantastic thing, and I'm glad you're talking about, you're giving us a chance to talk about conflict in the workplace, because if any of you are looking for a second career or a new career, there's plenty of conflict in workplaces and a huge need for people who are good at working to resolve and manage it. So let me tell you just a little bit about the Scheinman Institute before we dive in here. It's Liz and I are both faculty members of the Scheinman Institute on Conflict Resolution, which provides undergraduate and graduate courses, including teaching students to do peer mediation of conflicts on campus, which has been a very innovative and interesting program Liz is deeply involved in. And we also, of course, do research on conflict and dispute resolution in focused on workplaces. And we provide a ton of professional education and technical assistance on conflict in workplaces all over the country. So let me talk a little bit about what we're going to do in this very brief period that we have together, unfortunately. We want to give you a sense, and we're going to go kind of quickly because this is stuff that we would normally cover in a 2 to 4 day workshop, but since you're an accelerated audience group, we figured we can go pretty quickly. We want to explore some general frameworks for understanding conflict in the workplace. The conflict causes a lot of confusion for all of us. And so we want to give you some ways of maybe thinking about what's happening when conflict is occurring in the workplace. And then introduce you to what we call a diagnostic approach for preparing to address conflicts. And we'll talk more in depth about that. The idea here is that you need to think about what's going on in the conflict before you dive right in. And then we're going to follow up with some strategies and techniques that you might use, in conflict conversations, and of course try to leave time for some questions and discussions. So let me hand it over to Liz and get us started.
Awesome. Thanks, Sally, for laying out that agenda for everyone's favorite workplace topic to talk about. As I'm sure everyone can imagine, there are lots of different sources of conflict in the workplace, and conflict can be very hard to define because of how many ways we can think about it and how many ways we can define it, and also because it's always happening all the time in many different ways, and also is inevitable and part of not only the workplace but life. So this can show up in personal and cultural ideas about conflict, right? We're all socialized in a variety of different ways, so we all are coming to the table thinking about conflict differently. Diversity in every sense of the word. There could be different goals, different tasks that people are coming to with different thoughts and perspectives, different values. This can look a variety of different ways. I think one of the things that's coming up the most for folks these days is these intergenerational challenges in navigating, working through or working with people who have different just values on life and how they come into spaces. Different roles, status differences, scarcity of resources, expansion of resources, and also this inclusion and exclusion. And so in thinking about conflict, we frequently ask ourselves, like, is this a breakdown of the communication process, a product of incompatible goals or behaviors or values, different viewpoints in how we're approaching decisions or actions, or all of these things at the same time, which my bet is probably the latter. So next slide would be good, Sally. And so just as there are there are lots of different sources of conflict, there's also lots of different reactions to conflict. And most folks have like a default or a go-to reaction, again, depending on a variety of different reasons, right? And so again, similarly with, the sources, and we'll get back into this a little bit later, the way that we react differently can be different depending on the context, and also depending on the situation. And just as individuals have a go-to or a default reaction, institutions or organizations might also have a default or go-to reaction. So this is where this is how we always do things around here, or this is the way that things go around here might come from. And those organizational reactions can also influence how individuals within the organization react, and vice versa. And so anything else you would like to add, Sally, before we move on to talking a little bit more about reactions?
I will say that all of us have seen these reactions. But being aware of what your preference is important, so that you know that you're actually engaging in that reaction, and potentially having some control over it, about whether it's the appropriate reaction.
Yeah. And so just for a fun little question, because Sally and I are curious, anybody have any thoughts on which of these is the right reaction? And you can type this in the chat if you have thoughts.
Or the best reaction, or the most appropriate, however you want to frame it.
Okay, got lots of collaborate, some compromise, some diffuse. Okay, we've got an it depends. That's one of my favorite answers. No right answer as well. Lots of y'all coming in with responses. I appreciate the engagement. Yeah, so as people are saying, it really is contextually or situationally dependent. And another question, just out of curiosity, which do folks think is the most common reaction that folks have? Okay, looks like there's broad consensus on avoid. And so with that, Sally, you can go to the next slide. Really quickly, I want to ask folks to react with the reactions, or again in the chat, how many of you like dealing with conflict at work? Or if you want to share an emoji reaction of what dealing with conflict makes you feel like at work. We got some thumbs down. Phoenix said, I do. I also like dealing with conflict at work because that's what I get paid to do at work. So I guess I should probably
like eye roll.
Yeah. These are all very natural reactions, partially because of this like physiological response we have to conflict, right? Sometimes, you know, your heart starts beating a little fast, and you start sweating. Some people get a little shaky. And because of these physiological reactions, again, it's very valid to feel this sort of discomfort, right? And this discomfort can manifest into defensiveness or feeling stressed or vulnerable or powerless. And also can result in this like fight, flight, or freeze physiological reaction that we hear a lot about. And so thinking about these reactions in addition to the avoid and compromise and collaborate that we talked a little bit about earlier, it makes sense why a lot of the folks in this Zoom think that avoid is the number one reaction, because like no one likes being uncomfortable, but as we'll dig more into in this session, it's a natural part of life and a natural part of work. And so we'll think about how we can, instead of avoiding, and sometimes avoiding is the right answer, depending on the situation, but instead of like default avoiding or default running away from it, how we can really lean into these conflicts as they come up, think about them a little critically, and then make the best decisions on how we move forward. And so with that said, I'll pass it on to Sally. And if you'd like to add anything else, feel free.
Yeah, I love that. There's some folks who are saying, I don't love it, and you don't have to like conflict to deal with it, but I'd rather address it and not let it fester. And that's for those of us, the majority of us who really dislike conflict for all the reasons that Liz just talked about. In the workplace, it's serving a purpose. And so it's not necessarily bad. We often think, oh, geez, we're going along just great. And now, you know, conflict explodes and we won't be able to get anything done. And conflict in the workplace functions sort of like a symptom. Like if you get a pain in your elbow, it's your body's way of telling you something's wrong, right? And you've got to do some diagnosis. It's telling you there's a problem, and it might be a problem that you can just, you know, let go. We'll leave it alone for a while and see if it goes away. It might be so acute that you do something immediately. It might be, you know, I'm going to wait and watch. And you do some diagnosis of that pain. Conflict is serving the same purpose in the workplace. It's telling you something may need fixing. And so you've got to diagnose it and see how much energy you should be putting into it and how soon, right? And the second thing is conflict can't be resolved unless you engage with the person or the group who's part of the conflict, right? And in fact, they're your best resource for getting it resolved. Trying to resolve conflict on your own, thinking, you know, by yourself about what to do is far less productive than actually engaging. And that's the part that all of us worry about, right? Is the engagement part. And so we're going to talk about how to prepare for engagement and then some engagement skills. And the good news is, you know, since conflict is serving a useful purpose, when you are able to resolve or manage a conflict, you know, productively, it can be a real source of learning. You find out, you know, what's going on. What is the underlying problem that's been causing this conflict? You've got a chance of making some better decisions so that it doesn't continue to occur in the future. And you've also got a chance to actually improve your working relationship. A lot of us are very worried about the risk factor of dealing with conflict. Oh, I don't want to engage in this because it's going to ruin my relationship. Well, not engaging can also ruin your relationship. And so if you think about a conflict that you've been through in your work life or in your home life that you kind of successfully managed or resolved, often you have a better working relationship afterwards because you've developed some trust. Wow, that was difficult, you know, and we got through it. So I know next time something comes up, I can go to Liz and say, all right, you know, this is really tough, but I know we can talk about it. So it can actually help you build stronger working relationships as opposed to avoiding it. So let's keep going here. Let's talk a little bit about then what might you do before you dive into a conflict. And as I'm going to talk about some diagnostic frameworks, and as I'm going through this, take a moment and picture a conflict at work that you're involved in either currently or in the past. I'm going to give you just a moment or two of silence to think through a situation. And as we're walking through the diagnosis process, kind of see if you can apply it to your situation. So everyone pause and think about a conflict, a current or past conflict. Okay, you got something in mind that you can picture? Usually the bad conflicts come to mind pretty quickly, so.
Just one, just one.
Yeah, just one. Okay, so let's think about what does it mean to diagnose conflict? Uh, Conflict is often, presents itself as this big ball of hurt and pain and bad behavior and, lots of emotion, et cetera. And so want to take a little bit of time to step back from it and really think about what might be causing the issue, what might be the source of the conflict. And Liz ran through a gigantic list of potential sources in the workplace. I mean, there's plenty of sources of conflict. So thinking about, is this, really due to the fact that we're, in budget cutting mode? And is that, one of the sources of the conflict? Or is this due to maybe some different cultural backgrounds about how to deal with conflict, different approaches to it, and people are acting differently? Is this due to maybe it's a natural conflict between, different status levels? People who are more senior versus people who are newer, generational conflicts. So thinking a little bit about what might be the source of the conflict, but then doing some analysis of what kind of issue is this, the type, who's involved, right? And how big is it really? And we'll talk about that, about scoping conflicts before you dive in. So very briefly, 4 types of conflicts that can be happening in workplace disputes. One is just a simple relationship conflict. We're having conflict about the way we're behaving towards each other, about how we're getting along. We don't disagree on the substance. We don't disagree on the task, about how we do things. We don't disagree about the decision-making process we're going to use. Everybody's included, but we really are having conflict that is very much about how we're treating each other. Versus a conflict that we get along just fine, but we have a serious disagreement about how to do something. We call that a task conflict. And then other conflicts are, no, we're not so at odds about the way we're doing things and we get along, but we do have a conflict over who's going to make the ultimate decision. And I've been through that situation a couple of times where I was working really hard with groups, as a third party on the relationship and the task, only to find out that actually that wasn't the problem. The problem was they were all sitting there saying, and who's going to make the decision in the end? And it took a while to get to that point to realize that's where the conflict was. And then we can have status conflicts about who's included and excluded, who's part of this conversation and who's not about part of this conversation. Okay, so the one thing is to really think about what type of conflict are we dealing with, and then also understand that sometimes conflicts are nested. It's a task conflict, but it's nested in a historically bad relationship. And so a couple of things can be occurring at the same time. And so you're going to have to kind of figure out where to start, right? Can you deal with a task conflict in a historically bad relationship? Do you need to work on the relationship before you can deal with conflict? And the second thing is to know who you really should be working with. There's levels of conflict, right? There's the internal conflicts that we have. And I'm wondering if any of you have had the experience that I've had with a colleague or two who were naming conflicts with other people when really the conflict was their own internal conflict. I can't decide what I think about X, Y, and Z, so I'm sort of, questioning everybody else, but really what I've got going is a dilemma internally. So think about that. Is this a conflict inside yourself? Or is it a one-on-one conflict? It's me and Liz. We have the conflict, and I need that, which means I need to deal with Liz and figure out what's going on. Versus it's not Liz and I that have the conflict. We might disagree on some stuff, but it's actually the group that we're working within has a series of conflicts, and the entire group needs to be involved, not just Liz and I. Versus our group is just fine, but the conflict that we're having inside our group is actually due to a conflict that we're having with us and another unit. And they're imposing something on us we don't like, or they're causing us issues, and we're mistaking that for a conflict within our team. So you want to know who you should be engaging with, right? And not mistake an intra-group conflict with an interpersonal conflict. oh boy, the group's really got to get together and work on this. Well, no, actually, it's Liz and Sally who need to get together and work on this. It's not a group conflict. So thinking about where's the right place to start. All right, and then the last diagnostic question is, how much energy should you put into this particular conflict? And a couple of things, because you can't deal with everything, right? Conflict is constant. It's a fact of life. It's a natural part of organizations, and in fact, it's can be a productive part of organizations because conflict, well, it's a natural part because change causes conflict, right? And conflict causes change. And so it actually serves a purpose. It can actually change some things that need to be changed, but you can't deal with everything. So a couple of questions. How frequent is this? Is it occurring over and over and over? I saw somebody commenting in the chat about, letting things fester. It's like it's been going on and nobody's dealing with it. Versus how impactful is it? And it might be a one-time conflict, but if you don't deal with it, the impact is really substantial. So thinking about where on this scale would you put yourself? If it's a frequent conflict, but it's got low impact, some of those things we just live with. Yeah, people constantly complain about X, and it's really not worth dealing with because it's just not a big enough deal. Versus people constantly complain about X, and it's having an impact on our ability to do things. So that raises it in its importance versus a one-time conflict that may not ever occur again. And so it might be a person-related conflict or a situationally related conflict that's not going to come up again. And so maybe it's got low impact. We're not going to deal with it. Okay. Liz, questions or thoughts, comments?
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I would add when thinking about the different types and levels of conflict is just as you said, Sally, some of these are nested within each other, but also a lot of these are happening at the same time and interacting with each other and interconnected. And so when I think about contact or conflict, I like to think of this big web with never-ending connections and never-ending crossings. And for me, it's validating and affirming to acknowledge just how massive things can be so that I'm not like beating myself up about the fact that, I can't like 100% isolate this one problem and then completely fix it, because that's just like not the nature of our problems and our challenges these days, right? We're all experiencing so many things happening in our personal lives, in our work lives, and all of those things impact how we show up in every space that we show up in. And so I think like baseline, and this is what we teach our students in the campus mediation practicum course that Sally and Nicole mentioned, is it all, and in my opinion, starts with this being able to take a step back individually, hold the conflicts out in front of you, not remove your emotions and thoughts to invalidate them or minimize them, but so that you can look at the big picture and try to make steps and make moves from there. And so I find these frameworks really helpful to just like think about the big picture and the overall, and not get so stuck in my experience and my frustrations, as it's so easy to do these days. So.
Yeah, and I'm looking at a couple of comments in the chat, and I want to just go back for, whoops, wrong direction here. Go back for a second to, it's not letting me go back. Oh. Hello. Oh, there's a lag. That's what it is.
Exactly. There we go.
Okay, now we got come on, you can do it. The internet's churning, the wheels are churning. Anyway, what I wanted to comment on was a couple of comments about what about nepotism, or people, saying they want to collaborate and you're not collaborating with them, but what they really want is control. And that's definitely a great example, actually, of I'm sorry, a process conflict. And people are saying, well, you're not behaving the way I want you to behave. And, if you did this, if you were more collaborative, they're trying to make a relationship conflict when it really is a process conflict. It's about how you're going to do things. And so it's important actually to, I'm with you on the conflicts with technology. It's important to actually say, okay, what we really need to be dealing with here is the decision-making process. We can figure out all the rest of this, but we have a conflict about who's going to make these decisions and who's going to have the control over them. And that's part of doing the diagnosis, is so that you can get to the heart of a matter, as opposed to messing around, in different areas that aren't really the issue.
Yeah, and then potentially causing more conflict in the process, which is sometimes challenging.
And prolonging the conflict. So
Right.
Let's talk a little bit then about how you might have these conversations, because one thing I'm going to say is that using questions is a major tool in conflict resolution, because even after you've done your diagnosis, you need to test that diagnosis with the other person or the other group. And here's how I'm seeing it. How are you seeing it? And because you might be wrong, or they might see it completely differently. And so you want to be able to know how you're thinking about it, but then the first step of the conflict resolution process is understand how the other party is characterizing it. So Liz, you want to talk a little bit about understanding?
So this is one of my favorite tools. This is the ladder of inference, in a way that we think about understanding our lens and examining our lens. So we think about the ladder of inference as really a roadmap of how our brains work in a millisecond and how they categorize things. So when we look at this first bottom level, the world of observable external data. When we're first born into the world, we have all of this observable data. And as we move up the ladder, and as we continue to exist and have experiences, all of those things, our brains filter data and continue to categorize things. And as we filter data, we add meaning to things. And this is cultural meanings and personal meanings based off of all of the interactions and different levels of socialization that we're experiencing. And then we continue to make assumptions based off of these meanings that we've made. And we draw conclusions based off of these assumptions that we've made. And then we're continuing to update our beliefs and take actions based on those beliefs. And a lot of people put this in the same line as, confirmation bias. And so looking at this ladder of inference and thinking about this, thinking about our lenses really gives us the opportunity to first acknowledge what's happening and acknowledge that this is happening, and then also ask ourselves what we're missing, so we can get back to this entire world of observable data instead of just continuing to further narrow and narrow and narrow. And so when we think about examining our lens, there's this space and ease almost to revisit why we are so attached in a way that helps us become less attached to the things that we are constantly reaffirming for ourselves. And so yeah, I think that's a very valuable tool and a really gentle reminder to keep asking ourselves what's missing, because it's not, quite frankly, not possible for any of us to know everything and know all of the options and all of the experiences. And so it's an encouragement to keep learning and keep growing and keep pursuing and pushing for more knowledge and understanding and perspective. Next.
I'll just add one thing, that this phenomena that you said we do this in a nanosecond, and we do. It's, Liz says something that confirms, something that I already believed, and I'm like, yep, that's that. That's how she is, or that's what she believes. She might have said 10 other things, but I've already made this assumption and confirmed my beliefs so quickly that I'm not even aware of it. Right. And it's how, the old adage about, you can put 6 people at a meeting and they will come out and tell you 6 different stories about what happened in the meeting, right? And it's exactly this phenomena. And our brains are so quick that it's a task to slow it down, to say, whoa, what else happened? What did I choose to hear and what didn't I hear? But what did I choose to see and what didn't I see? And that's where the conversation with other people come in, right?
And that's not easy. It's like a real, sometimes can be a gut-wrenching reality check, punch in the face to yourself, because this is opposite of how all of us are really taught to interact with each other, especially in workplace settings, and especially in like these hyper competitive and hyper professional settings. So I always encourage folks when we're talking about these tools and skills, and Sally can go ahead and go to the next slide, to be patient with yourselves in the process, because this is not easy work, but it's also work that we're going to continue to have to do, right? And so thinking about how to sustainably maintain this ability to continue to ask yourself questions and continue to be willing to seek out different perspectives is challenging. And so it's going to continuously be challenging for ourselves, for each of us, but just as, going back to the physiological examples that we were talking about earlier, it's a muscle that you continue to work, and it does, in my experience, get easier with time, but definitely something that you have to consciously be working on. So here are a few skills for challenging conversations. We call them the skills of amplification, another framework that we work through in our courses. So these amplification skills make what is being said more audible and intelligible to members of the group. So the first one is focused listening, which is this type of listening you do not to respond, but to just listen and to understand. And with focused listening, the priority is really on this mindful listening with no distractions. Listening for what you need to know and what you need to gather and understand from what the other person is sharing, not listening to automatically solve the problem and diffuse the situation. And I can imagine lots of leaders in the room are natural problem solvers. And so sometimes it's easy for us to get so fixated on the potential solutions instead of actually hearing what folks are sharing as the challenges. And it creates this almost limited time that we have to address these challenges, because we're so fixated on getting to the next point. And then also staying tuned to the essence of why people are in the room together. So preparing ourselves to take that step back and hold conversations in front of us so it can help us frame and guide conversations. And then next is reflective feedback. So this is not parroting verbatim, word for word, what someone else just said, not repeating literally like a transcript, but you're taking highlights and keywords from what someone shared, paying attention to what they're emphasizing and to what emotions stand out the most, and using it as a way of validating what you just heard from that person, and also giving them the opportunity to add additional context if you missed something, or if in your reflection, they're hearing you reflect back what they said and they're like, wait, I actually didn't really mean that. This is what I meant, giving them that opportunity in that space to clarify. And typically the reflection tool is used throughout the conversation. And this leads maybe to the other person trusting you a little bit more, because they can tell that you are listening to them. We also encourage people not to use these hyper therapized words or phrases, because sometimes they can come off as a bit condescending. So, so what I hear you saying is you are feeling very frustrated by the situation. If you want to match someone's tone or match someone's energy, be that's really frustrating. You are clearly very frustrated by what just happened, blah, 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 blah. And then next is strategic summary. And so next is checking in. I think strategic summarizing actually should be next, but it doesn't matter. So strategic summary at the inflection points of the conversation. So when you're shifting to the next portion of the conversation, you clear up one topic and then you're moving on to the next topic, doing a sort of more thorough or in-depth summary of what you heard, kind of combining all of your reflections just to make sure that section is closed up and you're ready to move on to the next. And then checking in after each summary, asking a check-in question or a transition question, kind of is there anything else that you would like to add? And then after asking that question and giving that other person the space to add additional context or say, actually, I'm good. I think we covered everything. Then you can start with, do you want to talk a little bit more about the impacts of X? Or, okay, so where do you want to go with this after, having the time to check in and summarize? And also sometimes the check-in question is seeing if you want to continue the conversation, right? So sometimes in conflict, things get heated, right? So sometimes it's maybe in the best interest of all of the parties to just like take a breather, take a second, take like a bio break, get some water. Sometimes I need to go take a few puffs of my inhaler if I get too worked up, and then come back to the table a little bit later after people have time to like clear their heads and really think through what they want to share. I think there's sometimes a lot of pressure in this, really fast pace society that we're living in, where everything's on the go. I frequently refer to it as like the turbo mode culture, to just like quickly respond and like quickly check the box and get everything done. And I think there's some situations that require a little bit more patience, as challenging as it is, to just like give people the space to really figure out what it even is they're frustrated about. So this is something that we see with our students frequently, is that, when we're asking them, okay, so what were the impacts of the situation on you? A lot of the times when we ask them that question, that's the first time that they're like critically thinking about what was going through their head in the moment, right? I think a lot of times we're very much so on autopilot. And so like giving ourselves the space to just like pause and be like, okay, so my heart's beating and I feel like I'm annoyed, but am I annoyed or am I more so disappointed in what just happened? And those are two very different feelings, right? And so reacting to something as you are when you are annoyed might be a very different reaction than if you are naming that you were disappointed. And how you want to move forward with being disappointed versus being annoyed can also be two very different actions or steps moving forward. So just like thinking about that a little bit.
Liz, not to put you on the spot, but can I ask you, there's a great instance that's in the chat here from Elizabeth about generational conflicts and in an office. And I can imagine this situation. Can you see it there at the bottom?
Yeah.
I can imagine this situation where you're seeing this. This is happening in quite a few instances, and here's an opportunity to potentially engage with somebody on what is presenting itself as a conflict. I'm just not going to do this because they shouldn't be able to tell me what to do. That's a conflict, right? That's a task conflict, and a relationship conflict, and a process conflict. Can you just give an example of, when presented with this kind of a phrase from somebody, how you might start that conversation? I don't feel like I need to do what a younger person tells me to do.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of my go-to sentences or questions, and we like to call them back pocket questions, is, okay, can you tell me, okay, you're saying that you don't feel like you need to do what this younger person is telling you what to do. Okay. Can you share a little bit more about why you don't feel like you need to do that? And so from asking like those, I guess like clarifying questions or more open-ended questions, it allows you to kind of get to the root of what the frustration is, or the root of what the conflict is. So like from the situation that Elizabeth posted in the chat, just off the top of my head, it could either be some sort of frustration that a younger person is telling them what to do, or it can be a frustration with the task being unfamiliar, right? We don't know that based off of just this one interaction. And so if we're the person in a leadership position or whatever having this conversation, it would be in our best interest to really get to the root of what the challenge is and figure that out. And if it is this is unfamiliar to me, then okay, if this is unfamiliar to you, what can we do to better equip you to have the skills to deal with this? And then if it's a question of, I don't want this younger person telling me what to do, that's a larger conversation about values and expectations and norms within the workplace that on the surface could seem like a interpersonal conflict between this one younger person and this one more seasoned person, but in reality could be a much larger organizational or cultural challenge of not having the best like skills or resources to navigate such a multi-generational workplace.
Yeah, perfect. I mean, that's a great explanation of thinking about what kind of diagnosis do I want to do at this point in time, and how does this fit into the larger picture, and what's been happening, and is this an opportunity I want to take? Is it's not an opportunity? But also trying to find out, is my lens on what this looks like actually what's going on, asking the question. So we want to leave some time for some more questions, and so want to, if my lag time.
Yeah, and Sally, do you want to go to the last slide to just give people the
There,
last
yeah.
things to sit with? So this is kind of not context that we'll dive too much into, or content that we'll dive too much into, but just like food for thought for people to think about. And so assuming that there are folks on this call who are in leadership positions, who may have some agency or control in forming their workplace culture, these are some tools or some tricks, I guess, or some tips on building a healthy and transformative conflict culture. And so we'll just leave this on the screen and we can take some questions.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you so much, Sally and Liz. This is wonderful. And so many people in the chat have said, can we get the slides? All the content is so helpful. I just want to be clear, we are recording this session and we are going to share the recording with everybody afterwards, so you'll have access to the content. We've covered so much and we have, about 15 minutes left. So I want to just go over a few questions that came in advance and some stuff that came up in the chat. First thing, a lot of what I'm hearing as I'm listening and learning is, there's so many subsets of things that we need to think about in this diagnostic process. But like, how do we distill that down and apply this in real time, especially when emotions are high? People in the chat are asking, what role, if any, do our feelings play in the conflict? You've said, we need to avoid therapizing. There's a lot sort of we're swimming in. How do we start the conversation? How do we do this in real time? And you address that somewhat with the multi-generational question. But, if I'm feeling worked up in the moment, what is the best starting point for me to use this process?
So I would say that if emotions are high and folks are feeling worked up in the moment, best first step, take a deep breath. As cliche or easy as it sounds, I truly believe that like taking that deep breath and like not like gathering yourself to compose yourself because you don't want to bring like emotions into a space. That's not what I'm saying. But really taking the deep breath to figure out, what is it that I'm feeling? Typically when all of the big emotions hit and it's in the heat of the moment, we all know that we're feeling something. But I'm not sure how many of us can like concretely say, okay, I'm feeling disappointed and let down because my expectations weren't met, versus I'm feeling disrespected because someone just talked to me sideways and I wasn't raised to let people talk to me any kind of way, right? So those are like two very different types of frustration and types of feelings that are coming up. And I truly believe that like figuring out what that is for you first is ground zero. And then that's when you start applying these tools and skills. I think when we don't take that deep breath to kind of center ourselves and figure out what's going on in our head, that's when we have the tendency to bring a lot of stuff into the conflict that maybe wasn't even there to begin with. And in my experience, that's when, things that may have been a process or like a situational, I guess, challenge become interpersonal because people start yelling at each other and saying not so kind things. And so that's when things get like tangled up, because you're like, okay, I wasn't even really mad about that at first, but now you talk to me like I'm your kid and I don't like that. So there we go.
That's really helpful. And almost this idea of sort of identify the lane that the conflict's in and stay in that lane so that it doesn't become exacerbated into something else. That's sort of what I'm thinking. Like if it's, when I identify what the source of the conflict is and the type of conflict, if it's a relationship conflict, okay, let's stay in the relationship conflict lane and not move around. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah. And to Jackie's point, like when it descends to name calling, what do you do? I think I would encourage everybody to like spend some quality time with yourself and figure out what your default reaction is, what your style is, and like what works for you. Because like for me, if someone calls me, I know that if I'm up to here, I need to remove myself from the situation, because the moment someone calls me names, I'm calling names back. Like, just to call a spade a spade, like in the moment, if I'm met with that energy, I will give that energy back. So now I know that about myself. I'll be like, okay, I value this relationship. I value this project that we're working on. I'm feeling heightened emotions for myself. So I'm going to go take a moment to just like gather my thoughts so that this can be a productive conversation. I can either come back to you in 15 minutes after that, or we can come back in 15 minutes just to put a time on the calendar for us to continue this conversation. I'm very pro, like, if you are not in the headspace to deal with it, don't. If that's an option for you.
If that's an
And if
option.
it's not, I still say deep breaths. But Sally, if anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I mean, checking your body, are my legs crossed? Am I cutting off the blood flow, because I've crossed my arms so tightly now? Am I, clenching my fist? All of those things, if you can let them go, can help you physiologically. But also thinking in advance, as Liz is suggesting, about what's my go-to tagline for when things are too much for me. And I know I need a break, or I don't like the situation. And thinking about, what are you going to physically actually say that feels comfortable to you? Is it, this is not productive, I think I need to take a break right now, or then come back to this? I mean, what feels comfortable and professional for you to say in a situation, knowing that in advance, so you've got it in your back pocket, as opposed to, I can't do this, and running out of the room, is really handy to have, especially if you're in some conflict situations that are coming up, or you're in a tense workplace, having your out, to take that break is important.
So sticking in this interpersonal conflict lane, which a lot of stuff that's coming in it relates to that. What about situations where there's a history of conflict, and the organization, the group can't seem to break that cycle? They can't get out of it. They've tried different, we did a respectful workplace training. We've had one-on-one conversations about specific conflicts. Are there any approaches you can suggest? Or is this really a situation where you just have to manage the conflict day to day, and each day is going to be a different challenge, a different, some wins, some losses?
Yeah, this is where we get into the idea of conflict systems. And I think for managers in particular, there can be some real overlap between performance management and conflict resolution. And so individual managers or individual employees are trying to manage the conflicts themselves, and sometimes it crosses over into performance management of, somebody was saying, what if somebody refuses to do something? Well, as a manager, that's a performance management issue, but you can delve into why, they're refusing to do it. But at some point, it might be performance management. But most organizations lack an understanding or a laid out system for resolving conflict. And by a system, I mean not just managers and employees having skills. That's part of a system, right? Is to have skills, but having some capacity for what happens when those skills don't work. Where do you go? How do you get assistance? And so there's a whole range of potential ways to provide assistance to folks. There's facilitation methods, or facilitators. There's some organizations have ombuds offices for the big organizational conflicts and individual conflicts. You can have peer mediators. You can have, there's a whole range of techniques or options to put in place, so that it's not just on individuals to figure out how to resolve it with some skills. I mean, and everybody needs the skills, but then they need a process within which they can work. And when you've done everything you can, Liz has come to me, I'm her supervisor. She is having a conflict with me in particular about the way I behave towards her. And she's tried everything to resolve it, and she needs a place to go. What happens next? Is there any other place for her to go? To say, I can't manage this. We need a facilitated dialogue. There are places, we work with some organizations who have external mediators that come in. So having an actual organizational solution, as opposed to, well, managers just deal with it, or employees get better skills and stop disagreeing so much.
That's helpful. And does it sort of, so as I'm listening, I'm starting to think about boundaries, right? Like if you go to therapy, sometimes they will talk about having, setting a boundary and honoring that boundary in a personal conflict. And that can be quite sort of make sense in theory or make sense in your personal life, but you might feel like, well, how do I do that at work, particularly if there isn't this structure, like we don't have an ombuds at my job. And so I don't feel like there's any sort of protective system in place. How does the concept of boundaries kind of fit into this discussion that we're having?
Yeah, I think there's been a couple of comments in the chat about, sometimes it is a toxic workplace that has, remember we talked early on, Liz talked about there's an organizational personality to how we deal with conflict and an individual personality, and that organizational personality can be, or tendency can be just destructive. And if you don't have agency, to do something about it, it's probably like, I can't live with this, I need to move into a different space. If you have some agency, and we end up doing a lot of work with organizations who have, in higher ed, it's, there's a governance process. And so there's some groups who can say, we don't like this anymore, we're going to work on it. It's not just up to the people at the top. In some organizations, that's unions. We're working with unions. They're saying, we need to do better work on the conflicts that we can't resolve, through the grievance process. In some cases, that's, an HR group who has decided that this is enough. We need to take some agency and do something about this. But as an individual, if you don't have that, that ability, that empowerment to do that, you got to make individual choices about what you can handle. And that's sad. There's too many workplaces where people leave because of the conflict. And that's a waste. That's a waste of people who are excited, committed, creative, want to be in their workplace and end up leaving because of the conflict itself.
One of the questions that has come up a couple times in the questions that was submitted in advance and, the chat and some of the other questions about bringing sort of personal or political matters into the workplace. Obviously, we live in a very divided world right now, and it's been this way for quite some time. And it sort of feels like it is the new norm. How do we navigate that murky space of, personal, political things that maybe are not directly related to the workplace or your specific job coming in and infiltrating that? How do we navigate that space?
I think my answer to this question is probably going to be similar to my answer to the other question, but I think it is challenging to navigate that, your feelings or thoughts or whatever around things that are happening on a global scale or whatever in the workplace if you have not worked through that on a personal level. And so just speaking like from my experience in like reflecting on when things come up for me heavily outside of my house, it's when I am not taking the time to process and think through how things are impacting me before I even step into the workplace. And so as much as like most of my answers will be on an individual level, and maybe sometimes that's like not super helpful for intergroup or intra-group like conflicts, for me at least, it's really helpful to recognize that if people are not taking the space for themselves to figure out these things, then they're not going to be able, the likelihood that they're going to be able to make space for other people to work through them goes down. And so when those things do come up in the workplace, if I can name that and notice that, I'm not taking what they're saying personally, right? I'm not getting as frustrated with them being like, why are you bringing this up here, blah, blah, because I know why they're bringing it up here. You clearly need somewhere to talk about. Like you clearly have lots of thoughts that you need to work through. I would encourage that person to work through them with their trusted friends or even maybe trusted colleagues if they do have people in their workplace who they think they could talk to this about. But I do think, having that understanding of maybe why people are coming into a space the way that they are is helpful for me not to react based off of my assumptions, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And I'm sort of thinking just the concept of all we could do is control ourselves and our reactions to situations. We don't have any control over other people, particularly in circumstances where there isn't really a developed structure to manage these situations. It is doing your best to sort of protect yourself and shield yourself in a situation that may be toxic, miserable, whatever words you want to use to describe it. So I hear what you're saying loud and clear. One of the things we're coming on time, and so much has come in, and I'm sorry that we can't get to everything. This is obviously an incredibly important topic and that everybody wants to talk about. One of the things I want to end with is just this idea of how do we use the navigating conflict resolution, looking forward, sort of building trust in the workplace. Like, how do we proactively address it when maybe we want to avoid it?
Yeah, I think this comes to this last bullet on the slide here of doing your best to surface and normalize the conflict, and take it as a fact of life, as opposed to a judgment on the person or a judgment on our organization, or we're so bad, we have conflict all the time. And, we'd be really good if Liz wouldn't, just bring this stuff up all the time and cause conflict, everything would be fine. And so surfacing and normalizing it, and that's something you can do on an individual basis to say, whoa, okay, so wow, we got a real disagreement here. Or I'm seeing some friction right here, and do we want to talk about it? Sometimes you do that, in the moment. Sometimes you do it on the side. After a meeting, you go to Liz comes to me and says, you seem to that was a pretty emotional reaction in the meeting. You want to talk about what's going on there. But surfacing that or I could see you were really angry about that. You really disagreed, strongly with the decision that was made. Let's talk about it, and let's talk about whether we should revisit it, etc. So being that person who says it's okay. I mean, there were a number of people in the chat who said, yeah, it's not great, but I'd rather just, get in there and talk about it and see what the problem is and see if we can, make some progress on it than let it sit. That starts to change the culture. And doing what you feel comfortable with. Obviously, you don't have to be the person, but starting to normalize it, and not judge people for raising an issue. Right? Oh, geez, we were going along just fine, and now you've brought that up, and or nobody ever questions, the whatever the toxic behavior is. Why did you have to bring it up? Looking for ways that are comfortable for you to acknowledge that stuff is happening. Sometimes people use humor in a very productive way. Self-deprecating humor, not humor at somebody else's expense, but self-deprecating humor of like, wow, this just, caused me to, cross my ankles and, clench my fist and whoa, I mean, like you can help to get it to a place where it's talkable. And I think intergenerationally, that's also important. There's very different expectations among the generations about how to deal with conflict, whether you do it in a group, whether you always do it privately, whether you do it on email. I caution against doing anything on email having to do with
all the lawyers on the chat will agree with that.
That's going to be my book, is it's just a list of stories about conflicts caused purely by email. There weren't thinking about where to do it, when to do it, how to do it, and using whatever feels comfortable for you. I don't encourage you don't have to be the savior of your organization, right?
Sure.
But you can play your part.
That's
Yeah.
helpful.
And to that point, and I'll just add really quickly before we wrap up, each of us contribute to the culture of the spaces that we are in. Some more than others, sure. There's different levels of power dynamics, as someone just said in the chat, like sure, 100%. However, we all still have a little bit of agency as human beings on this planet in these spaces. And we're also, to some extent, all a little bit complicit in how things are the way that they are. And so I would leave my last point is that, when engaging with conflict or engaging in conflict, you are modeling behavior in either constructive or destructive ways. As someone said in the chat, like, you can't change how other people move or how other people act. You can only change or be conscious of how you are moving or navigating a space. And I always encourage people, like, don't underestimate how much power you have, because when people see you moving with intentionality and see you trying to extend the same grace and space for other people as you do for yourself, like, they notice that. And the leading by example is kind of underrated, but I think that's, in my opinion, like kind of the way of the future, right? So yeah, thank you all so much for sharing time and space with us today. I know it's a busy lunch hour, but thankful for all of you.
This is great. Thank you so much to Sally and Liz for this incredibly informative session. Really appreciate your time. I want to thank the alumni who attended today's session, and please know that Careers Alumni Affairs and the ILR Alumni Association, we want to know your feedback. You know, we want to ensure that we're providing you with the tools and resources that you need as you work towards your next career step. So look out for an email with the recording. There'll be ways to provide feedback, and you can share your thoughts via email directly to me, Cornell, ILRAA@gmail.com. I hope you'll tune in for our next session. Next week, we're going to be covering building your strengths and finding your flow. And then our last session, May 21st, is going to be on managing mental health at work, both incredibly valuable sessions. So thank you again. Have a great rest of your week.